Good morning. Bob Philo here again with lesson number 4 in our ancestral pursuit. This lesson will deal primarily with the Brown family, and I'll touch briefly on the Myers family. Now, the Brown family started off, the furthest back that I've gone was to an ancestor by the name of Thomas Brown, who was born in New Jersey in 1760. And he lived until 1830, passed away in Porter, P-O-R-T-E-R, Porter, Niagara County, New York, passed away in 1830. His son, I should say Thomas, was our 5th great-grandfather. His son, our 4th great-grandfather, was a man by the name of John Brown. John Brown was born in 1786 in New Jersey. He married his wife, a lady by the name of Catherine Myers, married her, and they moved to Niagara County, New York, Porter, New York, in 1808, thereabouts. And John Brown actually, I found a newspaper article that said he was the second known white man to inhabit Niagara County, New York in 1808. That's where our 3rd great-grandmother was born, Mary Brown Smith, who was married to George Z. Smith from the 3rd lesson, if you'll remember George Z. Their daughter was Martha, our 2nd great-grandmother, was Martha Smith Haynes. Her daughter was our great-grandmother, Martha Moore Hayne, Martha Hayne Moore, and her daughter, our grandmother, was Mabel Moore Thompson. There, that's kind of tough. Okay, getting back to John Brown. John Brown, as I said, was born in 1786, moved to Niagara County, New York. His wife, Catherine Myers, did not last long. She died a very young woman in 1821. She, as well as a number of Brown's ancestors, are buried in the Oakland Rural Cemetery in Porter, New York. One of his daughter, again, was Mary Brown Smith. Probably the most interesting relative of that family was a man by the name of Ira Brown, Mary Brown Smith's brother, Ira. Ira was born in 1818 in Porter, New York, and died in 1899. Prosperous farmer his entire life. I have one newspaper article that cites in 1886 he took 1,000 barrels of apples to market in that particular year. So he always did well in the community, highly thought of, very much an active person in the community. A school was named after him that actually wasn't torn down until in the 1950s. But one of probably the most interesting story I've ever come across in all of my genealogy work concerned Ira. This took place in 1896. I found a newspaper article that cited the story. Actually, it was a pretty famous story for the entire area. I found the story covered in 4 or 5 different newspapers across the state of New York. 1896. It all started off prior to 1896. There was a man by the name of George H. Smith, no relation to George Z., who had lived with Ira and worked for him as a farmhand. And at some point in time, he got involved in a trial in which George H. Smith testified against another man, a man by the name of Moore, no relation, who George H. Smith alleged had been smuggling Chinese workers across the Niagara River to work in Niagara County. Well, Ira Brown and Ira's son Sanford and 2 or 3 other people testified that George H. Smith was lying. As a result, the county sent him to prison for committing perjury. So while he was in prison, his wife divorced him, married another man, and George H. Smith became very bitter. He looked at all those people that testified against him, and his wife, his former wife, and her family as all being against him. So he plotted 7 murders that he was going to commit. He picked a day in the winter of 1896, and this is all cited in a newspaper article that I found. He was going to murder 7 people to get even. He started off at the home of Ira Brown. Ira gave him breakfast, and then George H. said, "Let's go out in the woods here and I'll help you load some wood." Well, Ira trusted him, but not that much. He said, "I can't do it. I got to go to town. I got other plans. Thanks, but no thanks." So George changed his plans. Sanford Brown wasn't home. Ira's son, another person that George H. was going to murder, plotted to murder, he wasn't home. So George H. proceeded to go to other victims' farms, trying to talk them out, spend the rest of the morning trying to talk these prospective victims out. They'd hear none of it. So he wound up at 1 in the afternoon at the home of his former father-in-law, a man by the name of Robert Clapsaddle. And he barged into the home. Clapsaddle was sitting in the parlor reading a paper. George H. Smith ran up to him, put a gun to his head, and blew his brains out. He fled the home and took off across farm fields. It was in the wintertime, so his tracks could be traced. Word got into the town of Ransomville, where this crime took place, and quickly a posse formed, a vigilante posse, and they took off after Smith. They traced him back to Ira's farm, where he had gone. Smith went in the house, into Ira's home, forced Ira's family out, and barricaded himself inside of Ira's home. The posse surrounded the home. A long period of time transpired where the posse tried to talk him out. He yelled out, "I'm not coming. I'm here to stay." So they proceeded to fill the house full of gunshots. The place was peppered. They finally, a couple of the posse members went up to a window, looked inside, and George A. Smith laid in a heap on the floor. They went inside. His body was riddled with buckshot and had 1 bullet wound behind his ear. They don't know if that was caused by one of the posse members or whether he had committed suicide. But it was a very famous case. As a result, Ira had to live outside for a day before the body was removed by the coroner. And finally, when he got to move back into his house, it was riddled with bullet holes. Ira petitioned, again, Niagara County. He said, "Through no fault of mine, this posse fired bullets, numerous bullets, thousands of bullets, into my home, and it's a mess. I got to repair it." And ultimately, later on that year, in the fall of 1896, the county board of supervisors ruled in his favor and paid him $500 to repair his home. The article that I send you regarding all of this is a very interesting one. It cites 2 versions of what took place. One version written by a Times reporter. I think they're referring to the New York Times, which is purely fictitious. And then the tail end of the article, written by a reporter for the Lockport Daily Journal, cited exactly what took place, but it's interesting to show how fake news even took place in 1896. So I mentioned earlier that Sanford Brown was one of the alleged victims, but wasn't home and saved his life, possibly. He was involved in a very interesting issue earlier as well. Found a newspaper article dated 1876 where Sanford Brown had gone to Lockport, New York, and was going to get a haircut. He walked in the barber shop and sat down. The barber, Paul Plaster, was cutting a young boy's hair, and he proceeded to cut the boy's hair, and he noticed that Sanford Brown was acting strangely, sitting there waiting his turn for the haircut. So he said to him, "Is everything all right, Brown?" And Sanford said back, "Mind your own business." So Paul Plaster did, finished the boy's haircut. He said to Sanford, "You're up." So Sanford got in a chair, and before too much longer, he suddenly stood up, turned around, and he said to the barber, "Are you Paul Plaster?" And the barber said, "Yes, I'm Paul Plaster." Sanford pulled out a gun and shot him. Luckily, the bullet struck him in the collarbone and didn't end his life. Well, Sanford immediately left the barber shop and went over to the police station, where he was ultimately arrested, and the story ended that the next day he was taken away to the insane asylum in Utica, New York. But he didn't remain there long, because as I said, in 1896 he was back on the family farm, which he ultimately inherited, and lived on the family farm until he ultimately passed away in 1918. So those were two very interesting newspaper stories that I found. If you remember, I mentioned that John Brown married a lady by the name of Catherine Myers. Catherine died very young and is buried in Porter, New York. And I found that a couple of her Myers ancestors, her actual mother and father, were from Germany, came to New York, or came to New Jersey from Germany, where Catherine was born around 1787, where she married John Brown in 1805. She married John Brown in Wantage, Sussex County, New Jersey, was born in Sussex County, New Jersey, and she and John moved to Porter, Niagara County, where our third great grandmother, Mary Brown Smith, was born. But an interesting fact, a number of Myers ancestors lived in and around the Porter, Wilson, New York area, and some of them actually moved to Genesee, Richfield Township, Michigan. 2 or 3 of them lived in Michigan, and I actually found one of the Myers relatives was born in Wilson, New York, I believe, a man by the name of Nathan, born in 1840-ish, thereabouts, moved after he served in the Civil War, the Union Army, from the state of New York, moved to Michigan, where he passed away in 1901, and he died in Cascade, Kent County, Michigan, and is buried in, I believe, the Lakeside Cemetery near Cascade, Michigan. So that will be of interest to the Thompson clan. Now, another interesting fact, John Brown had a number of children that moved to Michigan. One of them was John T. Brown, and this is of interest to my Philo family. John T. Brown owned a farm in Davison Township, Michigan, and I found out through my genealogy research, my family settled on Oakshade Drive in Davison Township, which actually was part of John T. Brown's farm. He had an 80-acre farm that he owned from approximately 1850 to 1860. And our home on Oakshade Drive was situated on his farm. He had 80 acres. He moved to Mundy Township, Michigan, which is where Cecil Thompson was born. He moved for a period of time, was living in Chesaning, Michigan, and he passed away in 1895 and is buried in the Bristol Road Cemetery in Flint, which is the same cemetery where Cecil Thompson, Bertha Thompson, Mabel Thompson are buried. So that's interesting. So the Thompsons were buried there together, a number of Thompsons buried in Bristol Cemetery, along with John T. Brown and his wife. So that pretty much ends the story as we know it today about the Browns family and the Myers families. I look forward to lesson number 5, in which we'll talk about the Moore family line, which goes way back to England. So until that time, I wish you all a good day and have a very pleasant day and afternoon. Goodbye.